Hi, everyone, and thanks for being with me. I want to talk about primarily in this session about Albanese, the efforts to be able to reinvent resources, services for domestic violence. Now, I'm going to have to admit on this one occasion that Albanese got it wrong. And this isn't very painful for me because politicians often get it wrong. No matter what your stripe, you're likely to F it up at some particular point, and certainly Albanese did it on this occasion. Now, to be fair to Sky News, they're appropriate in criticising Albanese for what he did. So I'm not going to be too critical of Sky on this occasion, even though I've got a couple of clips that I'm going to show you where they had a go at him. So what I am going to do, though, is suggest that what happened in relation to Albanese becoming somewhat, how can I put it, somewhat obsessed with the fact that the issue around domestic violence is a massive issue. It's got to be dealt with. Someone's got to deal with it. The government's probably the most logical people in the world to be able to find a way to deal with it, and they are. But Albanese did the worst possible thing that he could do. He actually chose to make it about himself. Now, politicians need to learn that not everything is about them. They might be the legislators, the policy makers in certain areas, but it doesn't mean it is about them. The situations which they're attempting to rectify, in this case, violence against women, is about women and is about women talking about their experiences in relation to domestic violence and what they would like to have happen to best rectify that. So Albanese stepped way over the line at a meeting, at a protest last week in relation to this, where he felt so compelled that because he is the most important person in the country, so he thinks, that he needed to stand up and talk about it. And the ABC, I think, put it quite succinctly, where they said Albanese was so desperate to prove he cares about gender violence. If you've got one thing, if you're a proper leader, it's not about you. Now, I just wish to say, though, that it's important to understand that Dutton is absent in relation to this. So that's the other side. It is one thing for Albanese to have got a little bit carried away with his own self-importance. It's another thing to look at Dutton and think, well, Dutton, you're just not interested in this subject whatsoever, so you're vacant, you're absent. Now, this is primarily because on this issue, it has to be bipartisan support. Any negative response about this, about domestic violence, working to resolve this massive problem, this epidemic, if you like, in Australia and in other countries and around the world, is if you took an opposition to that, you'd be seen as the devil incarnate. So, in this particular instance, Dutton has decided that it's best to, for whatever reason, stay back. Let's do nothing. Let's just let Albanese do it. And of course, when Albanese stuffs up, Dutton's colleagues at Sky News come in with all guns blazing, because this is something that can demonstrate Albanese as being incompetent. It's not about incompetence, it's just making a very shitty decision. And I'll just continue with the ABC article. The world is full of imponderables at the moment, and for Australian women, you can add a new one to the list. How long is it going to take for us to get a Prime Minister whose response to reasonable female anger isn't to trip spectacularly over his own tackle? The footage of Anthony Albanese attempting to cope with the febrile environment outside Parliament House at Sunday's domestic violence rally is nearly unwatchable. And I agree. I found it quite unwatchable. And I want to raise just a couple of issues in relation to this. The first issue is not only did Albanese stuff up, but the way the right-wing media, and I think other medias as well, so the mainstream media in general, let's put it that way, have chosen to focus on this incident. So when one looks at, I don't know the specific times, but if one looks at the amount of time spent criticising Albo for what he did and interviewing the woman who was running this event, is completely out of proportion with the issue itself. Now, what it has done, unfortunately, is it's used up space that completely is unnecessary, partly because of Albo's doing and partly because of the young woman that organised this event and the events around Australia. She has therefore received lots of attention. And as a result of that, she also, unfortunately, has flamed the fire about Albo's behaviour. Now, the point that I want to make is that part of the issue that we have here is around men not listening to women. And Albo, in this case, clearly didn't do that. That certainly wasn't his intention, I'm sure, but nevertheless, that's the optics of it. And eventually, something needs to give. And I don't think he's necessarily apologised, but nevertheless, we'll wait and see. Now, in terms of this, I just want to highlight some things that have been stated around domestic violence, and then I'll look at the Sky News issues. And so in on the conversation, they have this section here which I thought was quite interesting. First could be criminal justice reforms such as improving risk assessments in bail decisions and appropriately restricting bail. Now, this is a primary issue because it is important that when a person has been identified as being violent and abusive in the domestic or familial violence situation, it is important in that moment to be able to say to this guy, look, there are strict restrictions about what you can do. Now, I know that men don't tend to think of bail restrictions as being all that significant because they tend to break them all the time. But the problem is that perhaps they're not severe enough. So, for example, if a guy was told that he can't be within 500 metres of this particular woman and her children, then if he does contravene that, then he's immediately locked up. And also, when it comes to bail conditions, people that have got these convictions, or these allegations, I should say, should be remanded until such time as a court case can be up. There needs to be due process, I understand all of that, but it is also important to make sure that these men are kept away from their families. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this particular space. Police monitoring, GP tracking of those subject to an apprehensive violence order, I certainly agree with that. I think that's a must. Who are identified as posing and especially high risk could also be implemented. Some forms of tracking of high risk domestic and family violence offenders have been shown to deter violence in the US and Spain. Now, the question really remains, who's high risk? What sort of behaviours are we going to expect to be able to evaluate to decide whether someone is at high risk of domestic violence? So people who are at high risk should be incarcerated until such time as those cases are heard before the courts and an appropriate decision is made. The reason why this is important is because the number of men who continue to abuse their partners once they've been served and noticed that they have to go to court, those people often find themselves harassing, stalking their family, and they just won't stop. They just can't shut up. They can't stop doing what they've started to do, often regardless of the impending court case and possibly jail time. They're kind of Trumpists in a way. So something needs to be done about that. and let's see what can be done. But I also want to have a look at specifically what people like Andrew Bolt had to say in relation to this. Now, as you well know, Andrew's my favourite man. He's got lots of good things to say, and this is probably one of them in a bizarre sort of way, but it is highlighting the fact that the right have decided that this is a major issue because Albo stuffed up a matter, in fact, which I agree with. So I'm agreeing with him on this instance. I'm just not agreeing with the continual playing of this over and over again.
Anthony Albanese, another problem for him. He's just learned how dangerous it is for a male Prime Minister to go to a women's protest against male violence. Now it's exploded in his face. Publicly.
I think one of the classics here is that that Tony Abbott chose to be the Minister for Women. A fact I just want to highlight, given that this conversation about men invading and taking over the space that is available for women, particularly around an issue like this. However, we must not forget.
He called a liar, a bully, a misogynist. And I now have video to show he has been caught out, despite his denials. This is such karma, by the way. 3 years ago, Albanese mocked then Prime Minister Scott Morrison for wisely chickening out of going to the Women's March for Justice at Parliament House, where Brittany Higgins falsely accuses Liberals of covering up a rape.
Not so much a tin air as a wall of concrete.
But yesterday, Anthony Albanese turned up to a similar rally against domestic violence and the murder of 27 Australian women so far. 27. And right off the bat, he was accused of lying and got heckled.
To be clear, we did ask to speak, myself and Katie, and we're told that that wasn't possible.
Now, there is another video that does show Anthony Albanese at the beginning of this, and he was received really, really well. So it fascinates me how they have chosen to take just this one section. Now, as I said, I disagree with it as well, but nevertheless, Albo shouldn't have done this. He shouldn't have been there. He could have been there, but chose not to have said anything. And number two is that they took this little slice where he did make that issue about whether he was invited to speak or not. So how does Paul Murray respond around this? Well, what can we expect?
We've spoken for a few days now about the Prime Minister sending a woman into tears after she had organised a rally against domestic violence. You know that the Prime Minister's people have run around and tried to get everyone to look at the film, and somehow it absolves him of what you can see as the reaction of the organiser who called him a liar. I've said many times before that I think that what we've seen in his behaviour since and on that day tells us about his true character. Rather than saying sorry to the lady involved, instead he went for one of the worst tropes when you disagree with women, to blame emotion.
It's an emotion.
I think this is so hypocritical of Sky News that they're using this opportunity to talk about blaming others for being emotional, which is something they tend to do, actually, a lot of the time.
National day for people, and I get that.
And when that wasn't good enough and sorry would be a simple word, oh no, he couldn't do that.
Look, with regard to Sarah, I wish her well. I wish her well. People can see the video for themselves. They can see what people said and what people didn't say.
Now, amazingly, a couple of days out, it feels like we remain the lone wolf that is still willing to pay attention to what the Prime Minister had to say. But interestingly, there was an opinion piece which popped up from one of the lovies who finds a way to try to let Albo off the hook, but not before Annabelle Crabb makes this point. Albanese was so desperate to prove that he cares about gendered violence. By the way, do you like it's not domestic violence anymore? We're changing it now to gendered violence. That he forgot one thing. If you're a proper leader, it's not about you. The world is full of imponderables at the moment, and for Australia.
And I read you that article, so you know exactly what Annabelle had to say in relation to all of this. So they're the ones, that is Sky News, are the ones that have chosen to make a continuing issue of this simply because it's an opportunity to attack Albo. Now, for one moment, I'm suggesting that he doesn't deserve to be attacked. He doesn't. But they could be using this time, they can talk about it briefly, but they're using an enormous amount of time to talk about this particular incident, when in actual fact they could be talking about domestic violence. They could be going back to those things that I cited in the conversation article, which is this one here, which is about, GPS tracking devices, improving AVOs, and a whole host of things that could be done to help women who are confronted by a partner who is violent. So there is lots that could be done, but again, as per usual, Sky News have chosen just to focus on Albanese's failures in this instance, and I think the thing that fascinates me the most is that there is a degree of hypocrisy with Sky News that just blows me away. That anybody who is normally emotional to any extent is dismissed as a lefty, is seen as crazy, is seen or viewed as being weak. There's an indifference to them and so on. But in this particular instance, because it's Albanese and a woman cried, which is sad, I agree, that somehow this becomes a big issue for them. I just think they're friggin' full of hypocrisy, and what can I say apart from that? So if you do want to make a comment about any of this, about domestic violence in particular, please let me know. Put a comment somewhere below as well, just to let me know what you think. In the meantime, take care, look after yourselves, and more importantly, be safe.